Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Change Physician Podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, and I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady. And today's guest is obviously a fantastic guest. The number one reason why is they are also an anesthesiologist and did anesthesia training. This is Dr. Eric Larson of the Paradocs podcast. We're going to talk about his experiences, why he went into medicine. We may have to talk about why he chose the wonderful specialty of anesthesiology and to go into what you're doing now with Paradocs podcast and why you're doing it. So, Eric, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Just want to know why you even went into medicine in the first place. I think a lot of us have a similar reason, but from your perspective, what drew you in that direction?
So my origin story, I guess, my father's a physician. He was a family doc. He actually worked at student health at Michigan State University, and he's a DO. He trained in Des Moines, Iowa, and eventually worked our way back to East Lansing. So I sort of was familiar with what a doctor was. I wasn't familiar with call or any of that kind of stuff because he didn't take call. He didn't work weekends. He didn't work holidays. And so my vision of what it meant to be a physician was very distorted for most people. And so it just kind of seemed like a regular job, like, if you work in the bank or something. And when I finished, I liked math and science in high school, and I went to University of Michigan for engineering because I like math and science, and I thought that might be something I do. Well, always with the thought that if engineering didn't seem like the right thing, maybe just try medicine. And so, unfortunately, that's kind of like my story. I got into engineering about my junior year. I realized that I just didn't quite feel like I felt mixed and fit in with engineers. I wasn't quite an engineer for whatever that might mean. And so I realized that, of course, I hadn't taken any prerequisites. And there's this thing called an MCAT, which I knew nothing about. And so, I took some summer class at Michigan State when I went back home, and I took the MCAT, not realizing you actually could study first. So, it was really poorly planned out process. I ended up at the University of Iowa for med school and then did my residency there. Met my wife, who's a pediatrician. And I've drawn to medicine, I think, certainly after I've done it for a while, I'm drawn by the patient contact and sort of the fun things you do and the challenges that it poses, which are sometimes frustrations, but that's certainly the things that I think is just the relationship with patients and sort of that unique role you play in moving them along in their journey towards better health.
So let's delve into that a little bit, though, where you said, your father's a physician and you had this expectation of what it is to be a physician. And this has been a recurring theme throughout the podcast. So you start medical school and did anything change about what your expectations were with being a physician between your experiences being the child of a physician and now being a medical student?
Yeah, I think the consistent story I ever hear from when I talk to other physicians, the OR or wherever, that medical school is probably the worst experience of your life. And especially that first year, because you suddenly realize you're not that smart. You thought you were, and turns out you weren't. And so it's so humbling, which I think is actually probably good. I think a good dose of humility is probably a good thing to have at some point. And then, my dad's career was very unlike most physicians. And so that was sort of an eye-opening for me. Once you get into medical school and interact with residents and you kind of see how things work, and obviously things have changed dramatically since he was a physician, and training, DO training was much different than too. He did just an intern year and then he went out and practiced. And so that's, I don't even know if people do that anymore. I don't think probably so. So everything was just a lot different than I think what I had thought. Not that I had thought through things very, very thoroughly. I went to anesthesia because I thought it was fun. I didn't really look at markets or payment or lifestyle really. It just seemed like, hey, that's kind of cool, which is, I don't recommend the best way to go through life, but it actually worked out. So maybe it is the best way. I don't know. And so, you're asking about anesthesia. And so in University of Iowa, you actually have required rotations. They had always lots of trouble with people trying to front load their schedules as a third year medical student with certain specialties. And so if you didn't really know for sure, you'd never get into the harder to get into specialties like ophthalmology, dermatology, orthopedics. And so they wanted to make sure that unless you absolutely were certain you wanted to do those things, that everyone had an equal opportunity to sort of end up doing a 2-week rotation radiology or 2 weeks in anesthesia or whatever. anesthesia was never on my radar. So I ended up taking my 4th year. My wife, actually, who's a pediatrician, she ended up taking her 3rd year. And I came home maybe the 2nd or 3rd day from the rotation. And I said, this is pretty cool. I think this is what I want to do. And because I had been maybe thinking ER or something. And she burst out laughing, thinking I was joking, because she thought it was the most boring rotation she'd had in medical school. She couldn't think of a worse rotation, right? And then she felt terrible because I was being serious. And so anyway, that's sort of a kind of fun story about that. And so I went to anesthesia not knowing anything. And I don't know when you guys train, but you look younger than me. And you mentioned off air that you actually went to residency with my partners who's younger than me. So when I went to anesthesia, it was coming off just it had cratered, where no one had gone into anesthesia for a while. And I didn't know this. I had no idea. So, had I hit anesthesia 4 years earlier, I would have been like the only anesthesia resident from the American grad. I think there were less than 100 American grads who went to anesthesia one year and which caused lots of anesthesia programs to collapse and whatever. So when I was a 4th year medical student, I then decided, well, I better do a senior rotation in this. And so we had a 4-week rotation. And there were so few residents at Iowa, which was still a pretty good program in general, that I actually had my own room as a medical student. So I was I was the only anesthesia provider in the room for cases for like days. Like I'd have a day of just general surgery where I'd be doing hernias and I tell the story now. No medical student believes me because it's not like I'm not 100 years old, right? This is not that long ago that I was doing this. This is this millennium, and so I was there in a room doing my own case. I had no idea what any of the drugs did on the back table. I didn't know how much to give to anybody. I just had a handbook that told me, drop ephedrine, drop phenylephrine, drop propofol, or actually it was pentothal. We didn't use propofol at Iowa. It was too expensive. It was still a brand name. And then the first patient, of course, I'm sure it was an ASA1 hernia, simple, like 20, 30-year-old guy. Couldn't intubate him, not surprisingly, right? And my staff comes in and he is an very older gentleman. And he comes in, he intubates the guy with no laryngoscope, no gloves, and just lifts up with his hand and just tosses the tube in, doesn't even look, and intubates this guy, and just sort of like the classic mic drop. He just walks out of the room, and I'm like, this is there's no way I picked the right specialty. This is for me. I need to reconsider things. Only later when I did my residency did I learned that he's the guy everyone called when they couldn't intubate anyone, right? So he's Dr. Gersh, who's now passed, but he was that guy. So anyway, that was sort of my experience, and which was actually great as a medical student. I was running my own anesthetics and stuff. It's, again, looking back, it's bananas. I don't know if the patients had any idea, but.
Wow.
But yeah,
I can't even imagine having that kind of experience. That early on, that's insane. You were talking about these, some challenges or frustrations you found along the way. Obviously you kind of see them more as challenges or something to overcome, but there's I'm assuming some things that as your eyes open to the realities of the changing medical system and getting into, through your residency and into practice, is there anything that kind of, is the biggest lessons you learned that there was no way you would have known this before getting into it?
There are a couple layers to that question, I think. When I will look at things pre my podcast, I think is probably a good way of looking at it. And there are a lot of things that you just deal with and you're trying to figure out. The biggest thing is you have no control over them. Like an electronic medical record suddenly comes, you have to adapt and try and work your routine around, different system, computer system. It's hard finding information. Why suddenly do I not have propofol for 6 months, or why do I not have some other important like labetalol or fentanyl? I've experienced so many drug shortages through this time too, and so it's the frustrations oftentimes are things that are outside your control. So the biggest thing you have to learn is you have to adapt and accept those changes. You can't fix system global wide problems in your hospital. You can maybe try and correct little things, but I think they were just dealing with this stuff, and it is frustrating because you feel powerless. And I think, when you look at physician burnout, for instance, one of the big things is powerlessness, is that feeling that you can't affect change. So then after the podcast, when I started it, I had 2 or 3 episodes in mind. I didn't really have any idea what I was going to talk about. I thought I had some interesting things to say, but there was a lot of stuff I didn't know. But like one of the things was drug shortages. Why do we have them? And by interviewing all these people, I started learning more about the delivery system in the United States. I had a vague idea what I thought the problems were, but I can much better articulate it now. And all sorts of other things that I never thought of, I've learned about. And so sometimes in some ways just having information, even though you don't have power to change those things, at least knowing what the problem is and how to maybe address it, or at least know what it is, and that it's not you're just being crazy. I think that has been helpful. And then there's some life changes that have happened too, which have changed my approach to medicine, and I think it's changed me as a physician too.
Yeah. So just to reel back, why and when did you decide to do the podcast?
Well, if anyone who does anesthesia or spends time in the OR realizes there's a lot of music played in the OR. And I've never been a huge music person. I don't mind music. In fact, I don't even hear it. And so people ask me, like, what can I play? Do you mind if I play such and such? I'm like, it doesn't make a difference to me. I won't pay much attention. But the last thing I want to do when I get in the car is listen to music. And so I would always listen to either sports radio or maybe talk radio, because I'm interested in politics. I'm interested in sports. And after a while, I learned about this thing called podcasts, and that you could actually listen to specifically what you want to listen to. For instance, I could listen to Michigan State basketball podcast where I listen to just Michigan State basketball. No commercials. They don't talk about hockey or soccer or whatever. And I don't have to listen to idiots, call in on the talk shows, the sports talk shows, and those sorts of things. And the same thing goes for politics, right? And so I started getting into podcasts and listening to a bunch of them. And there are a couple podcasts to listen to where they're sort of talking about such a low barrier to entry into this sort of medium that anybody can do it. You may not have anyone listen to you, but you can do it. And eventually I just thought, after a couple of years, well, maybe I should just do it. I don't know. I mean, I've got a computer. I can buy a microphone for $70, and the hosting is pretty cheap. I mean, it is incredibly inexpensive to do this thing. The hardest thing is, of course, growing an audience and finding guests and doing it and being any good at it, I suppose. And so, I taught myself how to build a website, which was the hardest thing for me. And then all the other sort of mechanics of recording a show and editing and stuff. And it was just sort of it was another sort of like another challenge to try and figure out if I could actually do something. And so there's things in life where you just think, I wonder if I could do it. And, if it doesn't work out, it's not like I'm out much, except some time wasted in front of the computer.
Yeah.
So then on a personal standpoint then, because you kind of touched on a lot of different issues that we know that are present in medicine, the lack of perceived control over much of what we do, this isolation, it always seems like somebody's telling us exactly what and how to practice. And usually that person isn't someone who's actually practices or knows how to practice. Where are you seeing yourself go with the podcast then, or how is that interplaying with your professional life now?
Well, I've become an expert in the OR. That's been sort of interesting when it comes to stuff, whatever it is, because I just tend to pay more attention to those sorts of things, like, payer issues and third-party payment plans and drug shortages and all kinds of things. And so, I think you sort of become a mini expert, which is not really helpful, but it's sort of interesting. But I think I've been able to explore things more. And by knowing those things, it has made it a little bit easier being a physician. And also, I think I recognize when certainly talking about physician burnout a couple of times and I've talked about physician assisted suicide, but also physician suicide. The factors that go into it, I think just having a little awareness of what it is that causes problems, it makes it a little bit different when you're practicing and actually interacting with people in the day. I mean, I think I may go out of my way a little bit more to be less isolated. I've sort of changed in that I don't get as easily frustrated by things that I think that were maybe frustrating me before. I was very pessimistic about medicine before I started my podcast. And by that, I don't mean that we wouldn't have good medicine, but I think that the profession and the the trajectory of the healthcare system in the United States. I was very pessimistic that it was sort of I had a very doom and gloom sort of view of it. Now I see so many people who overcome problems and who find innovative solutions to solve problems that we have, even within the current very broken system, that I'm much more optimistic about human ingenuity, or whatever you might want to call it, American sort of entrepreneurship that's going to actually overcome a lot of these problems, no matter what impediments are put forth by an administrator, a bureaucrat or politician.
It's interesting hearing you say just that doom and gloom kind of perspective, and you've been exploring, a lot of different issues with the podcast. But I'm kind of curious, do you feel like there's an element of the fact that you merely allowed yourself an opportunity to do something outside of medicine that gave you an outlet for creativity and exploration and connecting with people? Do you feel like that's a part of it?
Maybe somewhat. I think it's always important to get other perspectives on what's going on things, because you get in a bubble, and especially in medicine, it's very easy. And maybe bubble's the wrong word, but I think you just talk to the same people. And so talking to people who are doing things that are different, unless I had sought these sorts of people out, I never would have learned about all this stuff. And you can certainly, I find my ideas for shows in social media or Twitter, or, wherever. But actually seek them out and try and get a better understanding of how someone is actually going about changing the pricing for pharmaceuticals, for instance, and recognize that there actually are possibly solutions that work, right? I think unless you actually go and seek that out, you're going to feel helpless. And so that's probably helped. And I think, maybe creativeness. I mean, I don't consider myself a creative person. If you listen to me try and sing or do any sort of artwork or anything, I mean, I'm not really very creative, but I think it's an intellectual endeavor, I think, to go about this. And so that probably it's an outlet which has been a fun thing, and the ability to connect with people and talk to people who I have no right to be talking to, because why would they be talking to me? I'm really nobody. I started my podcast. I have zero name recognition anywhere, and yet it's been pretty successful. And I have people send me books, and I would recommend, if you're like someone who loves reading books, start a podcast about books, and people will send you free books. I mean, it's stunning. People will talk to you. I have scientists and people I really respect in media who will do an interview with me, and I don't know. I mean, it's been a great experience for that, and so I think that has helped me become more optimistic about things. Probably just because like you said, you can connect with lots of different people, like you find, folks. I mean, these sorts of opportunities are pretty cool.
Yeah, you're a unique breed. We just had in a recent interview where, as physicians, we tend to be risk averse and not always willing to put ourselves out there out of worry of being perfect or knowing everything and how to do everything. But I think by putting yourself out there, it can be pretty amazing what can come back to you by just putting it out there. And I think people see that and are willing to let you basically propagate their message and allow that viewpoint or knowledge to be projected to other people. So, Kevin, any comments about that or other questions?
Coming about the comments of awareness. It made you more aware. You're more aware of the problem, and not necessarily maybe having a solution in any way, shape, or form, but there is a difference when you have a bigger picture view than this kind of confined place that I think a lot of physicians have allowed ourselves to be boxed into through many different ways. I mean, you go to medical school, it's a lot of time, it's a lot of effort. You start losing all the side interests and things like that. That persists through residency and maybe early practice or whatever. So it is easy to lose that perspective. So it's just nice to hear you talk about becoming more aware, increases your perspective, and just becoming aware of all the different issues actually changes how you perceive that issue, which then kind of impacts your physiology and your psychology behind it as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's sort of like being in a dark room. If you don't think there's a light switch, it's really hard to persist here. But knowing that it's there somewhere and that you'll find it eventually, I mean, that's kind of how I feel like a lot of these things. Like, I'm not worried about how we're going to fix things tomorrow, but I think, ultimately they'll get fixed, and that people, even if you may have people who are working against you, and I think we all feel like we have that as in medicine, there are plenty of people who want you to succeed, including, most of your fellow physicians and, obviously yourself and your patients. And so you're probably going to overcome those problems, no matter what sort of roadblocks are put in the way. Ultimately, now, maybe I've just a sort of like Lord of the Rings, eventually Mordor falls, but it's not an easy path to get there.
That's definitely
Nice. So what is your like when you think of your podcast and who you want it to reach, do you have certain audience in mind, or what they should get out of it? What's your intention?
So my intention was always initially my intention was to do it with another physician. And so we were going to be the Paradocs, and she backed out. She said, well, I shouldn't say she backed out. I kept trying to talk her into it. She just refused to do it. It's not my wife. It's someone else. And so then I just had to scramble, and because I had kind of rebuilt everything. And so it became a journey with me talking to people to understand various things that initially frustrated me. Like, I didn't understand, why are these things happening? Why don't I have propofol, for instance, or why don't I have fentanyl, right? And then you realize, of course, well, there are more than just like 2 or 3 problems. There are probably like 100 or 1,000. And so there are plenty of things to explore. But I always have focused my show on, like, I'm talking to people who are physicians in the room, but also people who aren't physicians, like the guy who's, the surgical tech who has some vague interest in medicine, but doesn't really have any deep understanding of how things work. And so I try and formulate my conversation so that it helps physicians understand better of why they can't deliver the care they want, but also to help patients understand the problems that our physicians are facing in delivering care and why they aren't getting the care they want either. And so I think, why is the patient physician relationship broken? So we explore that for all sorts of different reasons. And so I've never done official demographics, but my hunch is, and certainly getting messages from people and people who subscribe to my show, like who, send money, it's about probably a split between physicians and non-physicians. And so I always have to keep that in mind when I'm talking to people, to not get lost too much in jargon, or if we do, I have to kind of get back up. Okay, this is what MRSA is, or whatever it might be. And so that's been my sort of focus, because I don't want to have a show that's just for physicians, because I think I want the physicians to have a way to say, hey, this is how I've been talking about problems of charting and EMR. Listen to this, and get sent it to their brother or their sister or their uncle, and then they can listen to it and say, oh, okay, now I understand I don't understand everything you're talking about, but for the most part I understand why you might be frustrated about it. So I think that's sort of been the goal of my show. I don't know how effective it is, but people seem to be listening, so it must be working at some level.
Well, that's one of the fun things about podcasting too, and the internet media in general, is we have the ability to have these unique audiences in so many different ways. So if it is interesting to you, out of however many billion people we have now, 8 billion humans, there's probably at least a couple of them that are interested in whatever topics that you're bringing up as well. And I just think that's fascinating, because we've gone from this area where you had to have like the generic message, the 3 stations on TV, right, that had to fit like the majority of people, to an opportunity now where no matter what your interests are, there's someone who's probably going to be interested in with you, and podcasting provides a great way for people to develop those interests. And it's I'm just scrolling through your episodes here, and it's just really interesting to see you've had some really, really good discussions here on some crucial elements of healthcare as well as physician practice that many of the public may not necessarily be aware of all these implications. Like, I'm looking at how HIPAA destroyed patient privacy. Right. People think that HIPAA was a good thing. Well, there's what has it really done to actually protect privacy? Well, not as much as people would think. And MOCA or MOC, which is another one, right, where the public probably doesn't, maintenance of certification, which is a whole nother story and things. And so it's just great to see that you're being able to go into all these different topics that are definitely relevant to physicians, but also important for the public to be aware of. So kudos on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the MOC was actually one of the issues that I had. That's one of the first ones. MOC, direct primary care. And just a general delivery care system was sort of my initial things. And then since then I hear something interesting, and now I just go ahead and say, hey, I want to learn more about that. I'm doing an episode in a week on the 340B rule, which I never knew anything about until about 2 weeks ago, which is, way for hospitals to get cheap pass-throughs for medications. And they it's kind of a scam, like lots of these things. But so these are sort of things I can just explore and talk to people. So, and obviously lots of COVID, which, I'm guessing even when this gets released, whenever that might be, we'll still be talking about COVID, and it's not going to be going anywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
I'm there.
What's that, Kevin?
I think we have time with the COVID thing.
Yeah.
We can probably wait a year for releasing this, and we'll still be talking about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I was reviewing over, the topics as well, and it's those are some deep dives into some real critical conversations that, sometimes people just gloss over it because it's so frustrating they can't figure it out and understand the system. And so, like you said, it seems like it's a way for you to maybe get some hope that there are some strategies in place or that are being developed that could potentially affect change.
Yeah.
So that's great.
And I would add, if you don't mind,
Yeah.
So probably the biggest impact I think my podcast has had for me is, and you may notice on episode 25, in August of 2018, so almost a little over 2 years ago, just barely over 2 years, last Saturday when we're talking now, recording this, but our 14-year-old son died in a car accident when I was driving, and so shattered our world and brokenness, grief, and my wife couldn't work for a year, and so she's been back now for about a year. But the podcast actually provides sort of an outlet. I mean, I had started the show, and Andy would always kind of tease me about whether I'd gone viral or not. And I'm like, Andy, no, this show's never going viral, so don't worry about that. But I kept doing the show because I felt like it was the right thing to do, and I felt called to do it. And then probably about 9 months, or well, maybe a little over about a year after he had passed away, my wife said, maybe I should listen to some podcasts or something about parents and grief. And I said, well, go ahead. I think that's a great idea. And she said, well, I looked, I couldn't find it. I said, well, there are 600, 700,000 podcasts. You're clearly not doing it right. Let me search for you. Right? Mm-hmm. How many husbands have done that before? Right? So I go in, of course, I don't find it either. And so she decided to embark on her own journey. And so she started her own podcast, and it's been pretty popular. I mean, it's the where she just interviews other parents who've lost their kids and sort of how do you deal with grief and, go through this, and people have lost kids 10 years ago or 2 months ago. And it's been great healing for her. It's been, just great for other people, obviously. But I feel like my ability to help her start her podcast has really been the best thing that's come out of my podcast, is the ability to sort of help her do that and reach all those people, because ultimately we all want to do the same thing as helping people. And that's kind of why we go to medicine. I mean, and so anyway, I think that was sort of, from a creative standpoint, maybe that's the best thing that I've done. And her show's called Always Andy's Mom. It's at andysmom.com, but just for geography. But that's been the most helpful thing for us to sort of work through things. And it's helped me, and it's helped change me and when I was talking about personal things, this has sort of helped change me as a physician too. I'm much more empathetic than I used to be, much more compassionate than I was. I always thought I was, until you sort of go through this sort of thing, which is the worst experience, a parent can have, I think. It has just radically changed sort of how I approach medicine and look at things. And the frustrations, I don't let them get to me as much as I used to, because they're just not as, they're a lot smaller than they used. They don't seem as big as they used to, I guess, is probably part of the answer.
Yeah. I'm really,
I don't mean to bring it down. Sorry.
No,
okay.
I have so much that Kevin, do you want to go first, or?
Well, no. Well, I'm a parent. So as soon as I hear something like that, it totally impacts me. But I could see that is like having the opportunity to talk through. We just forget how powerful connection and communication can be. And whatever media you're in, it's powerful, but podcasting really gives you that opportunity to really connect with others. So I'm sitting here listening, and as you say that, it immediately just smashes me in my heart. And then I'm kind of imagining that process, and then thinking about your family and just how much good. Like, I'm actually shocked that there wasn't a podcast, because that is such a huge need. And the fact that your wife then you could assist with that, with your experience, and then create a podcast like that, where it is definitely not a subject matter I think anybody would want to have to discuss. But if you need to discuss it, it's really nice. I mean, to have a resource there is just so profound. So, wow, I think I'm a little overwhelmed at this point on the podcast thing, because I just can't even imagine. So,
yeah, no, I think what an amazing, like you said, the podcast gave you such a gift despite a tragedy to be able to cope with something that is such a, from a humanistic standpoint, like you said, you felt a different level of empathy for patients that sometimes may have been hard to tap into without going through it yourself. But for you to still be able to hold on to what you were doing despite going through all that, and then transform that gift to your wife to give a voice to help others that don't feel like they have a voice and need a place to tell their story or to just hear someone else's story. That is, what an amazing thing that you've done with all that's happened to both of you. And I mean, someone could have just thrown it all away and not utilize that and repurpose that for something so meaningful. So I just wanted to say thank you for doing that for a lot of the people that really need it.
Yeah, well, you're welcome. And I think it's been more therapeutic and helpful to us, as most things are. When you do things like that, it's probably more helpful to you. And it's been a great experience in that sense. I mean, you don't ever want to look for the good that comes out of things like that, because you obviously give it all back and more.
Mm-hmm.
But you have to sort of soldier on sometimes, and seeing all these other parents who have gone with it. I think, the biggest thing when you lose your kid is you think you're gone crazy. And I think, you're, as you can't do anything. And I would say, as a physician specifically, you can listen to the episode if you want, but I was doing CPR on my son out and I pulled him out of the van, and then going back to work. I went back to work like 4 weeks later, or I'm not sure how long it was. And they actually just left me in a plastic surgery center for a month or 6 weeks. My group, they're very good about it, just because the hard thing is like seeing all the different people all the time. And so going to a hospital setting where you're seeing you don't realize how many people and how many names until you start going to that setting. And so going to a small place where you just know people, you kind of tell the story once or twice or whatever, and you kind of get out of your system, and then you sort of just kind of go to work. But knowing whether you could actually, the last person I bagged and masked and bagged was my son. On the side of the road, and to suddenly have to put someone to sleep and then have to do that. I was pretty sure I could do it fine, but I wasn't sure. But also, when it comes to like finances, the fact that we had financial reserves in place, what a huge blessing that was, because we're not suddenly forced to work or forced to do things that we're not ready to do psychologically or emotionally. And so, I've talked to a couple of financial shows they've had me on, and I think, that's really because there are things you cannot anticipate. I think all physicians felt it this spring with COVID, right? They had a planned income and they have sort of all their expenses, and then suddenly something happens, you can't work. That can happen when you break your arm, or there's something tragic in your family, or stupid pandemic here. But there's always that unknown that we have to sort of be prepared for. So I think it's been, I think those are some lessons that I try and tell other people too, because they're just things there's so many things in life you can't anticipate. In fact, probably nothing you can anticipate. You only think you can plan and you have control, when really you probably don't really. And so that's been maybe one of the easiest things of the pandemic for us. We sort of didn't have many plans anyway, because at some point you're like, I don't know if I'm going to be up to do X, Y, or Z. So I'm not going to worry about it too much. But that's been a helpful thing for me. And it's been just helping her has been, helpful to me and the rest of the family. And I hope, it's helps others. And obviously my show is not nearly as important as hers. All I can do is I just have his solo that he sang. He was in the choir. And so that closes my show. And so it's just my little way I can sort of offer tribute to Andy, because nothing else I can really do for him, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful way to pay tribute to him. And I just think of the amount of perspective that you've gained, not just from your podcasts, but just these life events that as physicians, we think we can control, and we want to control everything, or even help our patients control what's going on with them. And the rude, reality is that that's not always going to be the case. And so, like you said, there's so many things that if we expect life to be a little bit turbulent and not always going to go the way we expect, we could be better prepared, or at least put the buffers to help us through those hard times. So.
Yeah. Accepting, I think, is probably the best way to look at it. Like, the person who cuts you off in traffic, maybe they're running to the hospital. Like I have a lot more, just those sorts of interactions don't bother me as much as they used to, where you instead of assuming the worst of somebody, you think, well, maybe they're having, who knows what they're going through, because heck, I was that person, a couple years ago. So I don't know. That's been just our human level, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. Kevin? Got you speechless.
It's probably my, I think the most challenging, as a parent, I think that is probably the most challenging thing, and just really quickly derails my brain, because then it obviously goes off in different directions, and I think how blessed I am. And so I'm going to try to focus back on our podcast here is, where do you see this going for you now, though? Where, with the podcast, with your practice, do you have a future plan that you maybe want to transition more to just audience building and podcasting and exploring that more, or are you finding yourself more on the physician side, or do you want to go off and become a painter? Maybe find that creative side that you said you weren't really creative before.
Right. Yeah. I'll avoid painting, because that's definitely not a good thing. I still remember in high school when we were playing Pictionary in Spanish, and I tried to draw a rabbit, and everyone just kept yelling Toro. They thought for sure I was drawing a bull. And so that's been scarred ever since. I think, when it comes to my podcast, my goal has always been to grow the audience. If I had any sort of goal, I don't look to really monetize it significantly. It's not one that I think lends itself to it, but I could be wrong. I mean, I suppose I just want to increase the reach and have more people go on the journey with me and learning more about medicine, because there's lots of cool things that are going on. I just want more people to know about them, and hopefully get some hope from that it's, not all doom and gloom. There are things to be concerned about and to learn about. And once you recognize the problems, maybe you can find some solutions yourself. I don't know. So that's been my focus. I think, I've joined the Doctors Podcast Network, and so they invited me to that. And so I'll be part of that whenever it launches, and I think sometime this year or later this year. So that
by
should
the time
hopefully,
this episode's out, it should be launched.
Right. Yeah. So that'll be that's going to be one of them, and so that should help a lot with the reach of the show. And I think that's pretty much my focus. I think I'll just continue doing things and exploring things as I see interesting. But I'm open to it moving in different directions. Like I've done some things in finance, I've done some things on science, and I've talked about forced organ harvesting in China, things that I find important that are somewhat related to medicine. I'll talk about them happy to have people send in ideas and stuff like that too, which I've used at times. I'm talking to some guy about fasting, which I've never done before, but I started recently just to try it out, and we'll see how that goes. And again, that's another person who I have no business talking to, but he agreed to an interview and, sent me his book and stuff. And so, so I'm just going to continue having fun doing this. And, if I start getting paid, I'm going to have to start treating it more like a job and be more reliable on getting my episodes on time. So maybe it's best if I kind of stay in pure amateur status and just, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, that is awesome. Any other questions, Kevin, or you want me to lead out?
No, I really want to take the time to thank you for joining us today, Eric. And it was a pleasure to talk with you, a pleasure to hear your podcasting journey, to hear insights and how it's interesting how you started this, just a curiosity into a lot of different facets. So I really appreciate you taking the time to develop that curiosity so that other people out there can enjoy it as well.
Yeah. And, thank you for, just sharing your exploration into this world of podcasting and being vulnerable and sharing your wife's ventures too. And we'll make sure that people know how to find both of you and seek more information and understanding and stories. And for those of you listening out there, this is the Change Physician Podcast. I'm Dr. Melissa Cady with my co-host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro.